Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Daniel here with another from the bookshelf book review video. So today we are looking at India's War, the making of modern Southeast Asia 1939 to 1945. So this book is by a gentleman called Srinath Raghavan. To read from the blurb, it says, between 1939 and 1945, India underwent extraordinary and irreversible change. Hundreds of thousands of Indians suddenly found themselves in uniform, fighting in the Middle East, North and East Africa, Europe, and something simply never imagined, against a Japanese army poised to invade eastern India. By the war's end, the Indian Army had become the largest volunteer force in the conflict, consisting of 2.5 million men, while many millions more had offered their industrial, agricultural, and military labour. In India's War, historian Srinath Raghavan paints a compelling picture of battles abroad and of life on the home front, arguing that World War II is crucial to explaining how and why colonial rule ended in South Asia. The war forever altered the country's social landscape, and when the dust settled, India had emerged as a major Asian power, with her feet set firmly on a path towards independence. From Gandhi's early support of Britain's war efforts to the crucial Burma campaign, Raghavan's authoritative and vivid account shows how India's economy, politics, and people were forever transformed, laying the groundwork for the emergence of modern South Asia. So this book is 554 pages long, if you include the index and notes and bibliography. In terms of actual text, it is 462 pages long, so quite long. As you can see, it is fairly chunky, but that is all just endnotes, index, bibliography. So, and one thing that is surprising is that for a book that is 500 plus pages long, this is surprisingly light. It was published in 2016 by Alan Lane, an imprint of Penguin. The text itself is fairly large. No complaints in terms of its size, it's very readable. Throughout there's a series of maps which just illustrate where events took place in the text. There's a plate section midway through with 30 images which cover everything from action shots. Whether or not they're posed or not is another story. Posters, a couple of pictures of the home front, just to give a general illustration of basically some of the areas in which Indian troops served, some of the characters involved in this story, and places where troops fought. So, in terms of the book itself, the context, it's 19 chapters, and in those 19 chapters, I think what Srinath Raghavan has achieved is possibly one of the best books out there on the Second World War. So the book starts off in 1939 and covers the Second World War through to 1945. It is focused on India, but I'd like to read a short extract from the prologue, just to sort of add a little bit of context to what I'm about to say. So Srinath Raghavan served for a number of years in the Indian Army, and during that time he served in, when he was undergoing training, he was presented with various troop names, so one of which was Kohima, and he admits that he was a bit ignorant as to what Kohima represented. To him it was a name of a capital. He didn't realise that the battalion name, rather, was a reference to a battle where Indian troops fought, and that other similar names of battalions were also referenced to names where Indian troops had fought. So what he writes is, over the years I have come to take a more charitable view of my ignorance as a cadet. There are two large and apparently uncontrollable bodies of work that are germinate to anyone interested in India's Second World War. On the one hand, there is the unceasing outpouring of books on the war itself. In most of these, India is rarely assigned more than a walk-on part. Some aspects of the war relating to India, especially the Burma campaign, have received more sustained treatment, but these tend to be insulated from the wider context of India's contribution to the war. On the one hand, there is a mountain of monographs on Indian history in the decade preceding 1947. Almost all of these, however, treat the Second World War as little more than mood music in the drama of India's advance towards independence and partition. The plot and the acts are by now wearily familiar. The resignation of the Congress ministries at the outbreak of war, the Cripps Mission and the Quit India movement of 1942, the Cabinet Mission of 1946, independence with partition in August 1947. So I found that paragraph rather interesting when I first read it, and I think it's applicable not only to myself, but well, a number of individuals, if not most people on the Second World War, in that India is often overlooked in the war. So I think while people realise that Indian troops did serve in North Africa, and obviously there was the fighting in Southeast Asia, in particular Burma, and the threat of the invasion of India, the role of India in the war is often overlooked. So this book begins in September 1939, and the debate as to whether or not India should be drawn into the war alongside Britain and the other elements of the British Empire, and sort of the Indian nationalist movement, and whether or not they should throw their lot in with Britain, if it's better to do so and then sort of call for independence after that, whether this is the outbreak of war provides India with the opportunity to call for independence now, or whether or not India should just sort of see how things turn out. It then moves on to chart sort of India's role in policing the Middle East, fighting the Italians, the idea that Russia might seek to invade Iraq, so how Indian troops were sent to Iraq to help bolster the defence forces there, before looking at the war in Italy and then finishing up in Burma. It also covers the economic aspects of the war. It's a very interesting book. I mean, there is one or two chapters which are dry on sort of the economy, but at the same time it's vital to understanding how India fought the war, in that war provided a great opportunity for India to make a lot of money and Indians to make money, particularly Indian businessmen. So it discusses how India tried to cash in on the conflict from the British government, and sort of the wrangling that went on in Westminster at the same time, in terms of India being this resource-rich nation. As the blurb mentioned, India was the largest volunteer force with 2.5 million mobilised individuals. So that was a great resource to the British Empire and to the Allied cause, and sort of it illustrates how Britain tried to draw on those resources to help fight, but it was wary of not giving India too much power, in terms of by calling on all of India's resources, it then give India more, no pun intended, more ammunition to call for independence. It gives the nationalist movements that. There is also, well, throughout is the interwoven story of the political calls for Indian independence. So there's a chapter dedicated to the Cripps Mission, but before that it discusses the Placenta Bay Conference of August 1941, when Churchill went and met President Roosevelt and signed the Atlantic Charter. And within that, there's discussions on the whole wrangling regarding the language of what freedom means and independence means and self-determination, and how Indians thought that the language applied to India. The Americans thought it perhaps should, but the British government thought no, it doesn't. And sort of how that threatened to boil over to a degree, which is an interesting story in itself. There's the whole argument of Britain saying that India could have independence, but sort of not at this moment in time, and then how slowly that goal was moved down. So it was, you'll get independence in, at X date, then you'll get independence at the end of the war. Now's not the right time, and how that argument was sort of played out. So it is a very interesting book. It does deal solely with India, so while the blurb does mention the campaign in Burma, that is given one chapter. It's at the end, and it sort of just ties up the narrative, really, because the focus is very much on sort of India and Indians' domestic rule. I mean, what I did find interesting is that there's 2-3 chapters dedicated to India's rule in the Middle East and East Africa, North Africa, and then one on Burma. And some of the events in Africa are described in detail, also events in Italy described in detail, but then India is sort of described when it comes to Burma as, well, it just sort of steamrollers over the Burma campaign, which I don't know, I find that a little bit disappointing to some respects, because obviously it was from India that the assault to retake Burma was launched. I think it could have been a little bit more information given in that regard, but still, I can understand why the author decided not to give Burma sort of more focus and focused more on India's role elsewhere, because it is overlooked. But I think all in all, it's a very well written book. It frames India's role in the conflict very well, and sort of gives India the credit that it's due in terms of the conflict. I mean, it was recognised by the United States that India was providing a valuable amount of resource to the Allied cause, and the Americans did what they could to try and sort of give India her dues against British wills. So I think this went some way to sort of changing the narrative on the Second World War in terms of refocusing how we view India in the conflict and the different elements of the war. It's it could have been multiple books. It is just one volume, and in that, it is a very good volume. It really does its job in terms of framing how the Second World War helped India to develop and led India to sort of become what we know it as today. The argument is very much a case of, if the Second World War hadn't come along, then India would likely have gained independence, but it wouldn't have been in 1947. The narrative is very much a case of the Second World War acted as a catalyst and basically made it impossible for Britain at the end of the conflict to deny India independence. So in that regard, the argument is that the Second World War directly led to the partition of India and created both modern India and Pakistan. So it is a very good book. If you've got the opportunity to read it, I highly recommend it. If you've happened to read it, please let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. We hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'll catch you next time. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more updates, like and share. You can also help to support the channel at Patreon. Details are in the description box below.